Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Ostermann. I direct European Studies here. It's wonderful to see so many of you on this beautiful March day. And thank you for making it to this session despite the good weather and despite the at times freezing temperatures in this conference room here. I'm thrilled to be moderating this session on Localizing Islam in Europe, book launch for Ahmet Yukleyen's new book, the same title, Turkish Islamic Communities in Germany and the Netherlands. We have a terrific panel lined up for you to survey and discuss the book. Let me introduce our three speakers very briefly. I think biographies were available outside, and then turn to Ahmet to give us an initial presentation on the book, and then invite Jocelyne and Peter to give brief comments, and then hopefully fairly quickly get in a conversation with all of you. So, Ahmet Yukleyen is the Croft Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Mississippi. He studied international relations at Bilkent University and completed his master's degree at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He received his PhD in cultural anthropology from Boston University in 2006 with a dissertation on the subject, research in Germany and the Netherlands, being funded by the Werner Gren Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Dutch Council of Higher Education. He has published, aside from the book we're discussing today, a host of articles in some of the leading journals in the field: Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Contemporary Islam, Immigrants and Minorities. I won't list them all. His research interests also have a broad range, include the anthropology of religion, ethnicity, Muslims in Europe, Islamic movements, and multiculturalism. He has taught at Tufts University and joined the faculty of the Sociology and Anthropology Department at the University of Mississippi in 2006, where, again, he is affiliated with the Croft Institute for International Studies. We have had the privilege and the pleasure to have had him with us here at the Wilson Center as one of our residential fellows for the past, 9 or so, not quite yet, several months. It's been just wonderful to have him here. He also won concurrently a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace, so he also has that affiliation. Ahmet, congratulations on this important book, and I'll turn the floor over to you and then introduce Jocelyne and Peter a little later. Ahmet.
Thank you very much, Christian. You are really kind with those words, and thank you all for coming and being here. This is really an exciting event for me. I've done, I guess, given many talks on this subject, but being this my first book launch officially, after the book is available, I really enjoyed, and I'm very excited about it. The whole list of institutions that I wanted to, thank has already been named, more or less. So I'm not going to go through that whole list, but probably mention the people that I worked with during my field work, and thank them all for, putting their trust in my scholarship, and this work is really a product of that relationship. So I want to thank the people that has really made this possible for me. I really want to get started by giving an overview of what's ahead, and then get into the material, really. There has been this popular question of whether Islam and, if you will, the West or Europe is compatible or incompatible, a popular question. Although this was not really the reason why I got into this field, there were an array of scholarly and personal reasons that got me into this research field. But this question is, as I have found out, is still lingering and still important even after all these years that I've now completed the research and published the book. So that seems to be an important starting point to keep in mind, which is a question that I will turn at the end of my talk. The two major approaches that try to answer this question could be named in different ways, but essentialist and contextualist is the way I approach it. In order to understand the context of Muslims in Europe, well, I'll give some details about that, and then really get to the core of my argument in the book, Localizing Islam. What do I mean by that term? There, I really look into the role of the Islamic authorities that speak on behalf of Islam in Europe and their activism, how they relate to the state policies and their role in Muslim integration. Because these are the aspects through which they reinterpret their understanding of Islam, their interpretation of Islam. And the argument, could be really summed up by saying they're really doing, they're basically learning by doing. That's the way to put it, I guess. That is, these Islamic communities or jamaats in Turkish are active in this environment, and the more they get involved with their projects, the more they have to rethink out of pragmatic reasons, out of this interaction. They learn about pluralism. They learn about democracy. So that's really the process that I'm talking about in an ethnographic way in my work. All right. So very briefly, I'm not going to do it in terms of university lecturing style, but just to give you a sense of what I mean by essentialist. Here, the core argument is that in order to understand any religion, and not just Islam, keep in mind, you need to look into the sacred texts of this religion and historical origins, because presumably these two will allow you to get an essence of any religion, those aspects of religion that will not change or that will resist to change, and that will allow you to understand, how the followers of this religion will act wherever or whenever they are. Many have already kind of criticized this approach. Briefly, of course, sacred texts can be quite deceptive because, which aspect of text you look at, history as well, can be treated very selectively. And the fact and the argument that there is a core of any religion that will allow you, to understand that religion is largely misleading, because that core is rather abstract and few in number in terms of principles. Thus, it doesn't really give you a sense of what the followers of any religion would act. Instead, many scholars, and primarily anthropologists, have looked into the approach of the contextualist, largely termed as here. That is, who speaks for a religion, and looking at the followers, the adherents of a religion, because the way they understand that religion is how that religion really unfolds in social life. The internal diversity of any given religion and the conditions under which these adherents really live shape the way that religion, takes place. So those conditions are the ones that are really important. Just to give you an example, if you look at any patriarchal culture, you'll find out that, they will look down upon, if not resist, to female religious leadership. That's, that works for the question of resisting ordaining female priestesses, and that will also be applicable to various Islamic communities as well. But this social, cultural, political context is what I really want to talk about, and thus, I will turn to, this context. Whenever we use the term Muslims in Europe, it sort of gives a sense as if we are talking about, some recent phenomenon. Just to keep in mind that historically, since the 8th century, you have large groups of Muslims living on the continent, and certainly there has been an indigenous Muslim population, not just immigrant, that has been living there, since the 14th century at least, if not earlier. Thus, what we're really talking about here is this recent, in the 20th century, meaning emergence of large group of Muslims, largely as a result of labor migration. There has been other reasons, seeking refuge from war-torn countries, seeking better life standards, and so on. But this labor migration is really the predominant reason, and that has brought a particular group of people to the continent. who were invited, to say the least, to really reconstruct the war-torn, if you will, Second World War-torn Western Europe. So they had a particular background of socioeconomic, low levels of education coming from rural areas. And that group of people had a particular story in time. And that story has unfolded in the 1960s with labor agreements, especially with various other countries in southern Europe, that eventually included countries such as Turkey and Morocco as well. These were male labor migrants, and Islam at this stage was invisible. 1973 is an important year because of the oil crisis, because by that year there has been actually the ending of this labor recruitment programs. But since 1973, all the way to the 1990s, we see a family unification. So it's no longer these male labor migrants, but also their families who have joined. And with that process, with the joining of these families, we start to see a process of institutionalization. People coming up with mosques, people coming up with Quranic courses on the weekends, and that has really created this process of institutionalization. And in the 1990s, we tried to see that people are shifting their interests from their countries of origin to the countries of their residence. Because by that time, they start to think that their future will be in Europe and not in their countries of origin. That is to say, with the growth of the second and the third generation. And that generation is finding their way into the religious leadership as well. And that will be an important dynamic in understanding localization of Islam as well. The year 2001, I picked that, but doesn't necessarily reflect, only single shot here, because 9/11 did have a big impact on, the interaction between Muslim minorities and the state and the larger society in Europe. Having said that, the understanding and the treatment of this particular group had already, was in a mood of shifting. There was a shift from earlier on as guest workers, thus, if you're called guest workers, Gastarbeiters, as in Germany it would be called, you are guests, all right? So so what do you expect from a guest? After a while, you want them actually to go back, right? So that didn't really, came to be, the case. By, as lined out here, the 80s and the 90s, we start to see that the same group of people were now divided along their ethnic lines, Turks, Moroccans. And by the year 2000 onwards, we see the same group of people being named as Muslims. Well, that shift in the naming of the group is very important, because now whenever, any acts that are carried out by this minority, it's attributed not to their socioeconomic level or not to their ethnic cultural aspect, but to their religious beliefs. And thus you hear about titles such as Muslim youth rioting, let's say in France, as it happened in 2005, whereas the riots didn't have anything to do with the beliefs, but largely their disenfranchised French young men who happen to have origins from their parents in North Africa. So the naming of the group and how that changes is very much part of our understanding today that needs to be underlined. And second, and the second formulation, which I really directly actually take from Jocelyne just sitting next to me, which I think is very useful to keep in mind: the equation of poverty, ethnicity, and religion. In the perception of the people, as well as the people who are living under those conditions, that equation has really crippled, in many ways, the emancipation of this particular minority. So one reaffirming the other. If you want to think of a closest analogy, you can think of the African American population here in the U.S. Without the religion element here, clearly, you can see how poverty and ethnicity are kind of reinforcing one another. Lastly, in terms of the context, just to remind you some of these figures, which you probably know all too well, you have all these numbers here, which I'm not going to go through one by one, but just to point out that whenever people talk about Muslims in Europe, they do not realize that there are three major ethnic, if you will, or ethno-national groups that dominate the scene of so-called Muslims in Europe. In France, you have the North African origin Muslims. In Britain, the South Asian, Pakistani, Indian. And in Germany, you have the Turkish origin Muslims really dominating, because you have about 2/3 at least of the Muslims, especially in Germany, that are coming from Turkey. And in the Netherlands, it's half-half, so it is nearly. Thus, the total number, can be estimated close to 15 million. Here, I want to point out that there are, of course, have been many studies that have been carried on Muslims in Europe, but just to remind you that Turkish Muslims, if you will, are the largest Muslim group coming from a single country. Despite this fact, I have to admit that in Europe there has been a lot of scholarship in this field, but here in the U.S., I hope, in particular in the English language as well, my book will be contributing to understanding this largest group of Muslims coming from a single country, that is to say, Turkish origin Muslims. Now, moving on to who really speaks for Islam, be it for Islam from Turkey or Turkish Islam, or for other, ethnic origin Muslims in Europe. It's really important to understand, whenever people say, well, this is in Islam, that is in Islam, but it's really important instead to ask who is speaking on behalf of Islam. Here I've come up with a typology of 5, which should be a general guide not only for Turkish Muslims, but also for other authorities, religious authorities speaking among Muslims of different ethnic origins, North African origin or South Asian origin. And the first group I talk about official Islam, the terms can vary, but in this category, I mean the groups, the institutions, the organizations that are controlled by the countries of origin. The Diyanet from Turkey, Ummon here, abbreviation, is the Moroccan States Organization in the Netherlands, and the Paris Mosque for the Algerian Muslims in France. Second group, of course, what do we mean by official Islam? Well, official Islam is really trying to control the Muslims and their beliefs in alliance with the countries of origin and their states' approach. Thus, somewhat nationalist and treating Islam more in terms of its ethical dimension and ritual practices rather than the political aspects. The second group I talk about is the traditionalist, and in this group you can find movements such as the Tabligh Jamaat or the Süleymanlı community out of Turkey. In this category, these movements tend to think that whatever is received from the traditional understanding of Islam should be kept as they are, and Muslims should be called for becoming better Muslims by becoming more involved in ritual practices and so on. So thus, they also stay away from politics. The third group, as the name suggests, the political Islamists, are the ones that are particularly active in the political field. Now, Milli Görüş from Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood, origin movements, in France and in other places, have largely collaborated in support of their Islamist agenda. Having said that, the origins of these movements, which did include a long-term possible intention of changing state according to Islamic law, has indeed changed in time, especially both for the case of Middle East as well as for the case of Europe. This group in particular is now trying to get Islam be recognized as equal to other religions in Europe. So that's how their agenda has changed, which I talk, of course, at greater length, in the book concerning Milli Görüş. The fourth category is the civil Islam category. Here, the understanding of Islam is to promote ethical, individuals who are pious and not retracting from social life, but trying to contribute to it through various projects, including education, interfaith dialogue, and in general spirituality. So they are not necessarily political, and they are not just interested in improving ritual or ethical life, but somewhere in between. So that's another important category. Sufis and the Gülen movement fall into this category, which I'll be talking about a little bit further in the presentation. Lastly, the revolutionary Islamist group. Well, their goal is to change the regimes, especially in their countries of origin, if necessary, by using force. So here, the groups that could be named are the Salafi jihadists, if you will, and among the Turks, there used to be, I have to say, a very active group, especially in the 80s and 90s, around the figure Cemalettin Kaplan, who has largely dissolved. But this has also been an important group, which I cover in the book. So here is a larger kind of picture of how these various categories that I have produced falls for the Turkish Islamic organizations. As you can see, Diyanet has the largest number of institutions in Germany and the Netherlands, and followed up with these other institutions and movements. Very briefly, I want to touch that the Diyanet is controlled by the Turkish state through its embassies in Europe, whereas the Milli Görüş has now made getting Muslim public identity recognized as their primary goal, rather than changing politics in Turkey, which is what they used to have, let's say, as a goal in the 1990s and earlier. And the Süleymanlı group focuses especially on Quranic courses by teaching, all Muslims, but particularly Turkish Muslim children, how to recite the Quran. Now, keep in mind that reciting the Quran doesn't mean that you understand what it says. And of course, thinking that you understand the Quran by reciting is yet another level. But Turks can't even get to that level because, unfortunately, they don't speak Arabic, of course. But it's an important ritual. It's a ritual of becoming Muslim. Thus, the Süleymanlı focus on that. Of course, keep in mind that all of these movements and institutions have some type of a Quranic course program. But Süleymanlı are really focused in this field. And here, the Gülen movement, as it is called largely, and the various branches they have in Europe, in Turkey, and other places, could be referred to as a community, are the ones that are focusing on education in particular and interfaith dialogue. Now, when I mean education, is not religious education. As a matter of fact, their focus is on math and science education. So their goal is to basically educate a young sort of generation of pious, well-educated, and largely integrated, I would say, to wherever societies they're living. That is their project of focus and activism. Whereas the Kaplan or the Kaplancılar, these groups have various names, but I prefer try to use as neutral as possible. And the Kaplan community, their focus has been really on the argument of the unity of religion and state, din wa dawla. So you can't separate the two. Thus, you have to come up with a program that will change, regimes. In this case, their goal was to change the regime in Turkey and turn it into a caliphate, somewhat inspired by the Iranian Revolution at its heydays, let's say. But then this group has largely disappeared because, because, as I argue in my book, because of in the competition of reaching out to more followers, they have lost to these other groups that I just named. On top of that, of course, their call for using violence if necessary was not quite welcome either. And especially after September 11, of course, in 2001, they were officially banned in Germany. Although I visited some of their kind of mosques, and that's some of the data that I have collected in addition to their publications. All right, so this is the larger framework which I developed to understand the relationship between these Islamic organizations, the state, and the Muslims. So these Islamic organizations, their primary source of income is really the support they get from their followers, from Muslims. That is to say, financial as well as voluntary work. In response, they are trying to address their concerns, right? So if the Muslims, didn't have a mosque, their primary object was to build mosque, which is what they did in the 70s and the 80s. But as with the rise of the young generations, their expectations have changed. The Muslims' expectations have changed, have shifted from changing politics in the countries of origin and from just building places of worship to areas of education. How do I get my children a better education in the Dutch or the German school system? Thus, they started establishing tutoring centers, in addition to claims of being recognized in public life. They don't want to be just invisible anymore. Thus, the whole debates concerning the headscarf and other things coming into the picture. So they have these different expectations from these Islamic organizations. They raise them, and in response to those expectations, which are somewhat deliberate depending on the organization, these organizations are expecting them to support them by financial and voluntary work. So that's this is the relationship that I'm talking about right now. But then there is a lateral relationship among the Islamic organizations, because they all kind of want to have more influence. They want to have more institutions. They want to have more power. So they are, in a way, competing with one another to recruit more supporters. Thus, their activism agenda is very much influenced by this competition. So if your programs, if your priorities are not keeping up with the demands of the people, then you are losing in that competition. And that's actually what has happened to the Kaplan community. They were really so out of touch that they have lost in that competition. And in this relationship, the state, here talking about European states, and to some extent maybe even countries of origin, but largely here actually the countries of residence and their state policies, they set the rules, right? Sometimes it is with punishment, that is to say disciplining, banning certain institutions, sending some of imams back to their countries of origin, and sometimes through the reward, through subsidy programs. So if you develop, let's say if you open up an internet or a computer room, let's say in your mosque building, in some room, some of these countries, such as the Netherlands, will give you funding for that. So, or if you set up an educational program, they will create funding. So through subsidies and this, punishment, they regulate, the activities of these Islamic organizations. And Islamic organizations are desperate, in a way, to get some of those subsidies, as well as largely to be recognized as legitimate players, because these organizations are negotiating between the Muslims and the state. So that's where their real power really comes from. That's why it's important to understand, these Islamic organizations, which have started off as transnational, and they're becoming more and more local. So that's really the core of the argument of my book, which I will draw really 3 examples to try to keep it brief and make sure that you actually buy the book as well. So. So how do state policies influence the way Islam is interpreted? Here the example really comes from Milli Görüş. Why? Because they are the ones that are more receptive to the policies of the state. And what I've seen in my work, during my field work, is that the Dutch branch of Milli Görüş was taking on a very different path than the German Milli Görüş. What happened is that the Dutch Milli Görüş was, in the eye of many, was producing a more liberal, a more democratic, and more pluralist interpretation. But it was not really, it was a collaboration, let's say, between their religious leadership, sometimes referred to as mufti or imams, as well as their PR guys. So what really happened is that in order to be legitimate in the eye of the state, their public relations experts were making Milli Görüş, the political Islamist group, let's say, by origin, a much more open one and much more transparent one in their relationship with the Dutch authorities. And that was paying off. How was it paying off? Well, they were getting support in order to build a big mosque in Amsterdam, for instance, and they were the various political parties were making the representatives of this Dutch Milli Görüş much more vocal in the media. And thus, in return, Milli Görüş leadership was responding. For instance, just to give you one example, in order to promote gender equality at housework, the Dutch Ministry of Social Work and Equality have promoted this program of promoting gender equality at housework. And the Milli Görüş, the Dutch Milli Görüş, have responded to that. They said, all right, we want to become part of this program. And what did they do to become part? Well, they have come up with a sermon. Well, in the sermon, it really, I've talked to the guy who has actually written the sermon, and the sermon was distributed to all the branches of the Milli Görüş mosques, and thus also delivered to all these mosques, to their followers on the Fridays, which really reminds, if you will, Muslims of how Prophet Muhammad was helping in housework, how he was doing his own mending, of his clothes and so on. So by bringing, these elements of tradition back into the sermon was really a result of this relationship between state policies and, in this case, Milli Görüş as an organization. Of course, this is a long story, many other examples that I illustrate in the book, but I'll keep it that here for now. The other component that I really believe very strongly that changes, these various Islamic organizations to adapt to their conditions in Europe is through their activism. That's what I mean by learning by doing. So these fields of activism that the various movements are engaged in changes them as they go through that interaction. So here the one example that I can give is through the interfaith dialogue experience of the Gülen community. In one case in particular, who was actually a very leading activist in this field, has told me that he started off these interfaith dialogue meetings with the Dutch non-Muslims, in this case, of course, in the 1990s, when he thought that he has all the answers to the questions and that it was a way to reach out to non-Muslims through interfaith dialogue. But as he put it, I've realized, he said, that we are asking for all the same things, for peace, for justice, for a clean environment, all these goals, these ideals that were shared. That has caused, this activist to rethink of the reason why he was engaging with interfaith dialogue to begin with. And this whole differences of religion was kind of disappearing because of this interaction, because people are asking for the same thing, but through different means, through different languages, through different ideologies, through different beliefs. As a result, he was questioning this whole thing, but he wanted to keep with this interaction as well. And then he kind of argued that neighborly relations should be the new basis of any interfaith dialogue. Because in Islam, you are required to have good relations, neighborly relations, regardless of the faith of your neighbor. And then he defined neighbor not just your next door neighbor, but the whole neighborhood. In that regard, a new justification for interacting with non-Muslims was created as a result of interfaith dialogue activism. So this is an unexpected consequence of interfaith dialogue. It doesn't always produce the stuff that you want, but it can produce these kinds of results. And for other groups, their kinds of activism works for their advantage, sometimes to their disadvantage. And these are some of the things I talk about as well. For instance, the Suleiman community talks about focusing the activism of Quranic recitation, as I pointed out. And that kind of activism does not really allow you to interact with the outside world, so to speak. Lastly, I will mention Muslim integration, because most people are thinking that these demands to be a greater part of the society should come from the state and its policies, whereas these Islamic organizations themselves focus on what we could call bridging activities as opposed to bonding. So bonding, you're just bonding within your own group, whereas bridging, you are reaching out. So these organizations, those that are active in the fields of education, in the fields of dialogue, if you will, in the fields of politics or public sphere, have to come up with bridging activities, which they do. And that's how they make their communities become largely a part of the society, the larger society. Of course, their focus on education clearly, helps the socioeconomic integration of their followers. And the rise of young Muslim leadership, this is very important because their role in shaping those Islamic organizations is very critical. Here, I want to point out an example that could maybe help you, understand how this actually happens in time. In the 1980s and before that, it was considered religiously prohibited to use bank loans to buy homes, kind of mortgages, right? So because in the Quran, the principle of riba is reminded, so interest is reminded to support this argument. But what happened by the 1990s onwards is that people started to rethink this position, okay? Just keep in mind, why not in the 80s and 70s, but the 1990s? Well, keep in mind that people are becoming much more permanent, so they needed to buy homes. Not only, someone, a member of the congregation, but also the imams, the leadership. And thus, what happened is they have actually reinterpreted through the principle of Islam, through necessity, through other means, and they've decided that it's actually religiously allowed to get mortgages. Now, this reinterpretation only happens through this interaction of and through reasons of pragmatism, through reasons of the conditions under which they find themselves in. That is to say, becoming from more temporary to more permanent residents of Europe. So these are the processes through which Islam is being reinterpreted and adapted to these local conditions. Now, is it all rosy and all good? No, of course not. There are many challenges ahead. I would just mention them briefly and then really conclude my presentation. The first probably and the biggest challenge is this equation that we talked about. If you are poor, middle class, working class, that is affiliated with a certain ethnicity, that is also affiliated with a religion, it becomes very difficult, to break from your group and to become part of the larger society. People tend to then group for their own networks, but also the outside community, the non-Muslim, let's say, community, treats them as an enclave, and that's a big danger. Certainly, Muslims being treated as a security problem as a result of the, if you will, the global war on terror is has added another dimension to this exclusion and pressure that needs to be rethought. Also, the rise of the far-right parties. If you're following European politics, you're certainly aware that the parties, in the, say in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party is now the, one of the actually parties that support now even the current government. So one of the three largest parties in the country, in the Netherlands. So, and the argument that these parties make are really turning Muslims and Islam into the other of Europe. So the European us versus the Islamic other is really developing out of that kind of discourse. And lastly, the revolutionary Islamists, be it the jihadists or groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir or the Kaplan community, although they have disappeared by now, they're very marginal, of course. Maybe less than 1% of the whole Muslim population in Europe are sort of involved in these movements. But they do get extensive media coverage, of course, and they do make them largely visible, with the way they dress and so on. Thus, the perception that there is this whole resistance against integration of Muslims appears as a result of that. In conclusion, we are in D.C. Just to brief, a few policy maybe discussions that could be of use. Avoiding essentialist language, especially in policy making and among the politicians. It's very important. And here you also have to keep in mind that essentialism does not only mean, Islam does not allow secular politics or democracy, but it's also can be treated as Islam is a religion of peace. You see, those simplifications, and presumed kind of assumptions about an essence of a religion is really, if you will, dodging the problem of understanding how Muslim identity politics actually work in that process. That is to say, how are the people understanding their faith, which groups are understanding it in which way, and how should we be responding in terms of our policy making to these authorities and their activism. That needs to be at the center of the discussion. As I pointed out, Muslim identity politics is really asking for Islam and Muslims to be treated as equal citizens of Europe. This is very important, although some people do not always get their minds around it. That is to say, when you hear about the discussion about the minarets or the headscarf, it's all the same thing. The Muslims want, what the other religious groups already have. If you have, church towers, why not have, Muslim minarets? In both cases, of course, the functional use of these structures are obsolete. Nobody actually goes to the church because they hear the church bell, or nobody goes to and nobody's really doing the call for prayer from the minarets. But it's a symbol. It's a symbol that I am part of this landscape. And if that is allowed, they will become much more part of this, of the society in which they live in. As a result, what I would say is that Islam adapts, in some sense, to liberal democracy in Europe. It happens incrementally, but it's on its way. I want to finish this presentation with a story of this picture. And if you really like it, you know where to find it. It's on the cover. So why did I choose this picture? It really tells, the story of localizing Islam. What is that story? You see, this mosque, which I was there for the opening ceremony as well, it's not too long ago built. It has been several years now. But it's all about the structure of the building. For one thing, as you already probably recognize, there's a crescent, right? And a star. Of course, the crescent has been used as a symbol of Islam, but the crescent and the star coming together could always easily imply you or remind you of how the Turkish flag looks like, right? So there's a crescent and a star. So, and this mosque, of course, happens to be, right, coincidentally, a Diyanet mosque, that is a Turkish or Turkish state-controlled, if you will, Islamic organization. That's one aspect, if you will, that goes into this building. But the other aspect is this. When they were coming up with building projects, the congregation and the people who live there, who used to have another mosque in this town, wanted to build a mosque that looks just like any other mosque, let's say, in Turkey, the Ottoman style, which of course goes back to the Roman style and so on. But and they wanted to have that kind of a building, which would be like rectangular, let's say, okay? And it will be in this direction because this is the direction to Mecca, to Kaaba, okay? So this is the direction it should be heading. But what happened is, if you come up with a rectangular building, okay, that's heading this way,
you have to point.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Okay, so this is the direction to Kaaba, okay, to Mecca. And if you have a rectangular building like this, okay, the Dutch city planners objected to this. They said, hey, we don't like that because that would make this building look rectangular to this intersection. You see, it will be like kind of like a building looking crooked, if you will, right? But because this is the direction to Kaaba, that's how it will be built. That's what the Muslims want to have. What happened is, one of the members of the congregation said, why don't we come up, okay, with a building that is actually, that has a crescent and a star on it. So he comes up with this idea, okay, and a Dutch, actually architect comes up with this, with the project itself. Now, you see, it's round, so it looks actually quite okay in terms of its relationship to the intersection. But also, it's okay because as soon as you enter the mosque, it actually, from the inside, it's heading directly towards Kaaba, towards Mecca. So that is to say, ritual expectations can be fulfilled in collaboration with the environment, in fitting in the environment, as long as we can use some human ingenuity. And that's what it was produced. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmet. Terrific. We have the privilege of two very distinguished commentators. We'll start off with Dr. Peter Mandaville, who is the director of the Ali Woodrow Center for Global Islamic Studies and Associate Professor of Government at George Mason University, where he was also the founding director of the Center for Global Studies. He's also a senior fellow at Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings, and his current research focuses on the comparative study of religious authority and social movements in the Muslim world, specifically with a focus on youth groups, transitional networks, and media. He's published a good number of books and articles. I'll just name the most recent, most important ones. He's the author of Global Political Islam, published in 2007, Reimagining the Ummah, 2001, and he's the editor of a forthcoming volume on political diaspora networks entitled Politics from Afar. He has testified before Congress, consulted for government, media, NGOs, and during the Arab Spring, he served as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. It's great to have you here. You have the floor.
Thanks so much, Christian. After that last slide, I'm tempted to ask a set of questions about Dutch obsessions with geometry. But the Muslims in Europe material is actually much more interesting. I want to start by congratulating Ahmed on what I think is a book of enormous importance. Really a book that I think that helps to take the study of Muslims in Europe into a new phase. And I think it fits with an emerging trend in the academic literature on this topic that we also see in recent works such as Jonathan Lawrence's book, The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, that pushes back against the kind of conventional narrative of Islam in Europe that is one about lack of integration, immigrant flows, security problems, radicalization, and says that if you dig beneath the conventional public discourse on these issues, you actually find a much more interesting, slow-cooking process of adaptation and, in Ahmed's idiom, localization going on. And I think it really takes the fine sensibilities of an anthropologist to help us to understand what this looks like in practice, and that's precisely what this book does. And again, because it's written by an anthropologist, it also helps to push back against some of the rather broad and sweeping categories that political scientists often get tempted to use, but which don't necessarily reflect social reality on the ground. So thank you for this great contribution. The book, also draws our attention to the fact that there is really no such thing as a monolithic Muslim experience in Europe. There is no such thing as the typical European Muslim experience. Of course, there are certain commonalities that one can point to across, say, the sort of the big three, Germany, France, and the UK, in terms of the countries with the largest Muslim populations. Commonalities in terms of the socioeconomic status of Muslims, commonality in terms of the historical trajectories of post-colonial migration, for example, in the British and French cases, and the guest worker labor migration example in the case of Germany that have kind of produced a critical mass of Muslims in Europe today. But we also have to recognize, I think, that each of these three countries vary significantly in terms of its own domestic culture around the question of the relationship between religion and the state. So although these are three nominally secular countries, the actual political culture of secularism in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom varies significantly, and this has had important impacts on the Muslim communities of those countries. Just to take two brief examples, in the French case, French civic culture is very much one that carves out a very particular privatized space for religion and advances a rather robust model of what civic culture is supposed to look like, and construct certain expectations about what conforming to that civic culture should look like. And in the realm of religion, it involves a fairly hefty firewall, or the drawing of firm lines between religion and public life. Whereas in the case of the British context, the British history and practice of secularism has tended to be more about the notion of religious pluralism, equal opportunity, the idea that different faiths and different faith communities should have sort of equal access to the public realm, and in some cases the sort of attention and services of the state. I think that it's most interesting to kind of tell the story of Islam in Europe as a generational story. Of differences between a sort of generation of arriving immigrants, depending on which country you're talking about, from the 60s to the 70s and 80s, and the shift to a second generation, a post-immigrant Islam, if you will. And these, refer to those Muslims who were born and raised in European countries, of which we now have a critical mass. And in some cases, such as the country I'm most familiar with, Britain, this model of European Muslimness is actually now in the majority. And it's here that I think, through this narrative trajectory, that we begin to really see the value and the richness of the research that Ahmed is presenting to us here. Because we see very clearly this process of what he calls learning by doing. A lot of improvisation, a lot of pragmatism, that is about, particularly in the second generation, recognizing the need to find an idiom of Islam that is suitable to the needs and the requirements of the environment and circumstances in which it finds itself, in direct contrast to the religious sensibilities and practices of their parents, who often would migrate from a village in Bangladesh to post-industrial cities in northern England and continue to try living their lives as if Islam was still in the majority, as if they were still somehow in a Muslim majority setting. And this had implications for everything from the extent to which they sought to build bridges with broader non-Muslim and national institutions and communities around them, to even their religious practices, where you saw a marked preference for, instead of the establishment and cultivation of a local capacity to provide religious services, to provide localized forms and idioms of religious authority, a preference to instead to import from their, what they still regarded as their home country, sort of itinerant imams and religious leaders who would sort of come in for brief periods of time, not, of course, speaking European languages, not familiar with the European settings that they were dwelling in temporarily. And I think this helps to explain then this sort of rupture of sorts, particularly in the realm of religious practice, that occurs between the first and the second generation. And indeed, it also helps to explain why it is that in some cases from the 1980s onwards, we began to see a sort of rising trend of politicized Islam in Europe. Because political Islam is not native to Europe, if you will. It's not the natural orientation or the instinctive draw that some of the more traditionalist communities that Ahmed talks about has been. Indeed, it is precisely the fact of this alienation of the younger generation from their parents' Islam that drove these kids towards movements like the various branches and legacy groups associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jamaat-e-Islami from South Asia. As they found their parents' mosques unable to respond to their questions, their needs, they were interested in an idiom of Islam that seemed more attentive to the kinds of questions they had, and they tended to find this in some of the more politicized groups. So I think the crucial shift that Ahmed points to is this process whereby in the second and now third generation there is this increasing confidence on the part of young Muslims in Europe in their ability to advance and put forward a vision of Islam and Muslimness that is suitable. And this has, I think, in some cases meant actually a decrease in their reliance on foreign-funded influences. In the 1960s, 70s, and the 80s, a lot of Muslim communities in Europe were quite reliant on funding sources coming from outside to build mosques, to provide religious leaders, in the absence of the Muslim community in Europe having its own capacity to raise funds to do that. But you now have a critical mass of middle-class Muslims in Europe who have the capacity to raise funds, build their own institutions, and are going about the process of constructing an Islam that fits and works within Europe, at the same time as they are starting to come to, as Jonathan Lawrence shows in his work, various forms of arrangement and accommodation in the legal realm with the states in which they live. And I think this is an crucially important process to understand, one we don't hear enough about, and one that a work such as this by Ahmet helps us to better understand. I want to conclude with a couple of points that kind of speak to this question of where we might be going from here. In some ways, Ahmed's slide on sort of the future of all this essentially preempted all of these points, but I'll kind of give you my rendition of them. I think, Ahmed opened by kind of drawing this distinction between essentialist versus contextualist approaches to Islam in Europe. We're dealing with a situation today in which the public discourse on Islam and Muslims in Europe tends to proceed still very much within this essentialist framework. There is the assumption, I sense at least, that when we are dealing with someone who happens to be Muslim, when the religious identity in question is Muslim, then somehow that is what defines that person. That is how best you understand who they are, how they think, their motivations, their worldview, their norms, everything. And it's related to this shift that Ahmed also identified from a sort of naming process that tends to focus on one's immigrant origins, to one that focuses on one's ethnicity, to one in more recent years that has tend to kind of name these people as Muslims first and foremost, to focus on, in some cases I would say, obsess with their religious identity. So what I want to do is to ask, is there some level at which we're dealing with a fiction of European Muslims, right? This is not to question that whether or not there are millions of Muslims in Europe. There are. What I'm trying to question is whether and when it is analytically useful to dwell upon, to focus on their religious identity as the best way to understand who they are, what they want, and how they can, and in other cases might have trouble fitting into European society. On some of the other indicators that we'd look at to see, how are things going, some of them on the face of it look good, right? 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, even as recently as 5 years ago, there was a lot of chatter about this idea of a Eurabia scenario, the idea that the Muslims are taking over, and you would get these alarmist demographic studies, and I use the term demography and studies very loosely here, that suggested that because of birth rates among Muslim communities in Europe, France would be a Muslim majority country by 2075. And the basic mistake made by these so-called demographers is that they were assuming that the birth rates found within French Muslim families in the 1980s and early 90s would continue indefinitely, when in fact subsequent demographic study has shown that European Muslim communities are displaying precisely the same pattern that you find in other immigrant communities in Europe and North America, which is to say that within the first generation you see markedly high birth rates, but then in subsequent generations those birth rates tend to adjust to more or less the national average of the countries in which they reside. So when you run the numbers, taking into consideration that demographic reality, this Eurabia scenario, just doesn't come to pass. For those of you interested in it, I would urge you to take a look at the study that the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life conducted between 2009 and 2011. It was a global study of Muslim demography that not just estimates the current Muslim populations of every country in the world, but also does projections for the year 2020 and 2030. So there's no Eurabia thing coming to pass. What is happening, however, that I think makes the future of Europe's Muslims still somewhat questionable and problematic is that a set of issues that used to be discussed primarily under the rubric of immigration and social integration have in recent years become securitized. And you know, the way that the United States has engaged this issue has contributed to it, because the United States never really, certainly Washington, D.C., didn't really realize that there were any Muslims in Europe until September 12th, 2001, when, you know, early post-9/11 forensics suggested there was this thing called the Hamburg Cell, and what's that? And, oh my God, there are all these Muslims in Europe, right? And so Washington wants to start having a heavily securitized conversation with European governments about, you know, violent extremism, and you get European governments initially pushing back, saying, no, look, we've known about this issue for years. This is really about immigration and social integration. And Washington says, no, it's about terrorism. We got it. And then you have the sequence of events from 2004 to 2005, Madrid bombings, the killing of Dale van Gogh, the London bombings, and suddenly Europe gets on board in a big way with the sort of securitization of its own Muslim communities. And so what's happened is that a set of issues related to integration and immigration have now become interwoven with a set of conversations about national security. The question of European Muslims' integration has become a security question now, rather than a question of social integration and immigration. And this, I think, makes it very difficult for us to kind of engage this issue in productive ways sometimes. And finally, Ahmed also pointed to the political uses of Islam and Muslims in Europe. This idea that with the rise of the far right, and with, I think, more than just that, with also the existential angst currently associated with the project of Europe more broadly, the idea that there are chinks in the armor of the progress of the European project right now. Part of that unconfidence involves the searching around for something against which Europe can define itself. You know, and one of the easiest ways to define yourself is to find a clear outside and other. And in many ways, I think Muslims have come to serve that function. You define the boundaries of Europe by defining what it is not. And for many, particularly in the far right, it is Islam. But the problem is not limited to the far right. I think we see it most dramatically there, but there are plenty of liberal and progressive groups in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, that are leftist, if anything, in orientation, but still have plenty of concern and problems with Muslims because what they perceive to be prevailing views within Muslim communities about gender norms, views on homosexuality, and things like that. So we find ourselves in this situation where, while some of the indicators suggest that, you know, things are going in the right direction, the prevailing discourse around this issue makes it, I think, very difficult for us to focus on, and in some cases lend support to those trends that are heading in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. On to Jocelyne Cesari, who is currently the Minerva Chair at the National Defense University. Welcome back to Jocelyne, who's participated in some of our meetings here in the past, and it's great to have her back. She, of course, has a major research focus on Islam and democratization in the context of the Arab Spring. Currently, she is an associate at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and teaches at the Harvard Divinity School and Government Department. She is a French political scientist by background, tenured at the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, and specializes on contemporary Islamic societies, globalization, and democratization. She is perhaps best known for her running the international research program called Islam in the West at Harvard. She has written a good number of articles and books. Let me just cite a couple of them. They include Muslims in the West after 9/11, Religion, Politics, and Law. And her two forthcoming books, I guess, one's entitled Islam Betrayed, The Making of Modern Islam and World Politics, and a second one that she's working on, Islam and Secularism in the West. Jocelyne, it's wonderful to have you back, and you have the floor.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. I would like to thank Ahmet because I'm very pleased to be here. Just a personal note, we met a few years ago when he was starting his field work for this PhD that is now the book. And since then, we met in Cambridge. We have been interacting regularly, and he has been a member very active member of the Islam in the West program that you just mentioned. So it's very rewarding to see someone going to the end of the PhD and publishing a book from it. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I would like to say a few things about the book. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very important book for two reasons. Because in the field of Islam in Europe or the US, unfortunately, ideology trumps fact. And lots of discussion or so-called knowledge that are circling around have nothing to do with empirical reality, but opinions of people, or so-called public intellectuals or pundits. And it is also part of, I would say, the difficulty or challenge of integrating or recognizing Islam and Muslims. So any book that tries to bring up and put light on the reality of people on the ground as Muslims, as leaders, is a very important one. The second point why this book is important is because it doesn't look at the text of Islam. It looks at the people of Islam. And I think this is important. You know, I always start my class since 9/11 by asking my students, because I teach on this topic at different level, what did you do after 9/11? And were they, you know, old enough to be able to do something intellectual? Most of them went to a bookstore, and bought the Quran. And I tell them, wrong move. The Quran is not going to explain to you anything about the event. And this is, I would say, a heavy phenomenon that is not only among lay citizens trying to understand, it's also among scholars of politics that tend to look at ideas, at text, to try to understand social realities. It is impossible to do that because the reality is between interaction, and the model that Ahmet showed you is about trying to bring to light and to understanding interactions between different poles, the society or the context in which you live, your kind of background you are coming from, and the kind of tradition you are struggling with. And this is an important point to make. Look at the people. Do not listen automatically to text or to discourse or to rhetoric. I'm not saying it's not important, but never take it at face value. That's what I'm after here. So the important point also that comes from all this investigation of Muslims leaders in Germany and the Netherlands is also the surprising, I would say, in more European context than maybe an American one, where Islam is a resource for integration. Americans can understand that religion is a resource for integration. When it comes to Islam, because of the post-9/11 context, it's a little more challenging. But what the book shows is that religion helps in the integration process, not only by bonding, like you said, but also by bridging. And we tend to forget this importance of religion as a resource or factor in integrating. Also, if I would like to bring, to broaden up your presentation, because the book deals with, indeed, the most numerous group of Muslims, at least in Western Europe. It's also the Turks immigrants in Europe are also the most dispersed group across Western Europe. The other important group is the North African group, Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian, and these groups tend to be more concentrated in the French-speaking zones. And you have a third group which comes from the Indian subcontinent, and they tend to be, most of them, in the UK. So the point here is to also, what is interesting in the Turkish case is that the Turks, more than any other group at the second or third generation, because in cases we are third generation, has maintained a strong ethnic identification in which Islam is part of it. when the other groups that to some degree maintain this strong ethnic affiliation are people from Pakistan or Bangladesh. But it's more than a national. It is not synonymous with national identity from the country from which you come. It has to do with ways of eating, memories, oral tradition, culture, customs, more than with national identity or national framework from Pakistan or Bangladesh. Interestingly, the people from the Maghreb have, again, I'm talking about third or in the case of Algerian, fifth generation in France, have most of them lost this kind of strong ethnic identification with a group. They are much more individualized to some extent than the Turks you are talking about. So does it mean that they have lost all ethnic sense? No. And also for the reason you mentioned, it's because in any daily interaction they are reminded by the other non-Muslim from where they come, and who they are. So it's also an interesting point to keep in mind. So the way that Islam is organized remains, especially locally, very much influenced by these ethnic, national, regional cultures from the countries of origin. The second pole of tensions or competition between different forms of organized Islam is indeed this new form you mentioned, which is the state intervention, which, again, from an American point of view, is completely, unthinkable, where states and also local organizations in most of European countries have taken initiative to create or shape the Islam of their country. And this is also leading to new kinds of elite, what we could call some kind of bureaucratic elite at some point, because they do not automatically, and this is an important point to say, have a strong influence among the vast majority of Muslims. This kind of, state organized leaders. And actually the whole process of integration of Islam that you describe in your book is not in their hands. It's in the hands of these kind of organizations that, in the case of Turks, are very much influenced by the national culture or the ethnic groups from the different, or even the religious strand from the country of origin. While for most of the other Muslims in Europe, the competition is between these different cultural trends or denomination coming from, let's say, the Indian subcontinent, and the major competitor here. It's some form of transnational Islam that you would know as Salafi, that I would not put in the traditional domain, but much more it's a revivalist movement. And the Salafi really tried to compete, not so much with the state form of Islam, but with this dominant, vibrant, diverse way of being a Muslim that borrows from ethnic or cultures of different sorts. And their motto is to say, culture and Islam do not mix. And they are promoting, you're talking about essentialism, a very essentialized vision of Islam, which is a deterritorialized, deculturalized, dehistoricized vision of Islam. And interestingly, the Turks in Europe are the more resilient to this interpretation of Islam because of their strong attachment or socialization within these different groups that you just mentioned. While I can see the effect of this transnational form of Islam on people who have grown in a more, I would say, individualized way of being a Muslim and that are very fragile to the discourse of Salafi in Europe. I would distinguish them from the jihadi, I mean, most of the Salafi I'm talking about are very conservative, illiberal, you can, call probably not democratic, but they are not jihadi. And the confusion comes there from the Western political aspect. Most of the jihadi in Europe are Salafi. So it's very difficult on the ground for law enforcement, for politicians to see the difference. Because you can have a very quietist Salafi separatist group in some neighborhood, and they dress like Bin Laden used to be dressed, you see. So it's very difficult to make this kind of difference, and it does indeed feed the securitization issue that Peter was mentioning. The trend that is winning, and I'm not the only one saying that, the problem is we don't have enough numbers about that. The trend which is winning is the civil Islam you mentioned, in which I will put the Muslim Brothers, actually. I have because what they have done in the last 20 years is really to evolve from a discourse, especially in Europe, from a discourse centered on the state and changing the state to a discourse based on civility and civism. And they are very present. I would say most of the time in big urban centers, they are very active vis-à-vis this, not only the working class of Muslims, but really the middle class of this new generation you are talking about, and trying to provide them with an interpretation, a framework in which they can be citizen and Muslim. And I think that in terms of what Muslims would envision on being a good Muslim and a good citizen, what the Muslim Brothers in Europe are providing is appealing. So it means they are civic, they are loyal to the state in which they live. It doesn't mean that they are liberal in terms of social values. And this, I can see, we just have confirmation of that. We did with the Islam in the West a huge survey among Muslims in Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam, and trying not to reach to the leaders because the leaders are too good in discussion. We wanted to reach out to lay Muslims who never go. By the way, most of the Muslims in Europe are not members of any kind of organization. So that's the one we wanted to reach, to find out what it is to be a Muslim and a citizen. And they confirm, what you hear from other surveys. They are civic, they are citizens. At the same time, they are very much attached to Islam, which for Europeans seems incompatible. When you have surveys of Europeans across nations, they always show a very, very low level of identification to any religion. When you do surveys of Muslims in Europe, it's the opposite. They show the highest level of identification to their religion. But it doesn't impinge on that sense of civism and loyalty towards the country in which they live. But it does impinge and affect or influence their social values. And what does it mean? It means gender relations. It means also the position on homosexuality. Does it mean that they want to go out and, attack homosexuals as their neighbor? Obviously not. But they're very interesting polling showing this kind of huge gap between what Europeans consider legitimate, including homosexuality, and what Muslims do not consider legitimate. And homosexuality is one of those. Interestingly, because no other religious group has this kind of presence on these issues, Muslims are seen as the problem. While in the US, this diversity of opinion, you have it across denomination. Or we have it here across denomination. So it does ponder, I would say, or diminish, mitigate this, so-called exceptionalism of Islam in the U.S. context. I will finish now on exactly this point. I think that there is indeed a process of integration at work, as the book of Ahmed shows, and Muslims are talking about it in a very positive way. What they complain a lot about is that Islam is not integrated. And it's a difference between, lots of effort for socioeconomic integration and the lack of effort for symbolic integration of Islam, which means also changing some aspects of the political narrative and including Islam within the national history. And a good example for me of that is the way that Islam is now addressed in the American public space. Because American Muslims from immigration do not have any socioeconomic problem. They are integrated. But today you can see the effects through securitization more than any other reason in the US of, looking at Islam as incompatible with American value, to the point that, to go back to your point on fiction, the Sharia debate in the US is a typical case. Muslims are not asking for any provision on Islamic law, but this idea that Islam can become a danger. And again, you have lots of surveys showing that Americans may have good relations with Muslims, but they have an issue with Islam. And I think this is because there is a need for symbolic integration. So as you said, we are at Washington. So there is a need to think of not only putting effort, and this is more European than American, in socio-economic integration, it's important, but as long as we do not also work on the symbolic integration of Islam, it will affect the overall process of integration of Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful and excellent comments. Usually I would give Ahmed a chance to respond, but since we're pressed for time, I actually wasn't planning on going all the way to 2 o'clock. So let's collect a few questions and comments and then give the panelists a chance to respond. Yes. Please wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you like.
Please.
On gender, my European friends, both in Germany and Holland, tell me that Muslim women, young girls, 18, 19, assimilate much better because they stay in school, they learn the language, they develop skills, they get jobs. Whereas the young boys, as one of my German friends said, are hopeless. With the result that no education, no skills, no jobs, and then what happens to it? On the issue of class, as your own research indicated, the 60s and 70s generation tended to come from rural villages and were often illiterate and lower class and not very sophisticated and so on. What happens now when a new generation of young people who are professional and educated and sophisticated and wealthier come into Europe? There's some really, I don't want to go on, but there's some really interesting parallels with Hispanics in the United States. One reason Americans have prejudices about Hispanics is the only Hispanics we tend to see are lower class, rural, illiterate, working, gardener Hispanics. And we're flummoxed when we run into, a real live, kicking, professional, educated, sophisticated Hispanic and don't know how to typecast. So the interesting parallels and differences from Europe. But could you comment on those two?
Sure.
Gender and class?
Sure. Thank you very much. I do want to remind, though, I did talk about gender equality at housework, but I take the question because it's an important one to elaborate further. First point, all the Islamic organizations that I've looked at do have women's branches. So that's very important. They do. There is segregation, let's say, in general, but because the women do not necessarily ask for public visibility and the leaders of these Islamic organizations do not necessarily put women in publicly visible positions, that it appears as if these movements in particular, let's say, are not maybe as much contributing to the integration, that is to say, socioeconomic integration of the women. But that's definitely not the case. As a matter of fact, interestingly, in my work, what the findings actually illustrate is that the women are actually a greater, number of activists in these movements compared to men. So that's actually very important to know. Now, of course, as a researcher, I have an obstacle. As I mentioned, there is the whole issue of segregation. And thus, for me, it was not as easy, of course, to navigate, let's say, what, really happens on a daily basis among the women and the women's activism. So certainly, in that regard, there is a challenge for me for research, and for other men, of course, who are doing research in this field. Now, your friend's observation that the Muslim women are, let's say, gaining socioeconomic status better than boys reflects, I think, this larger question that is, trying to keep yourself away from trouble, so to speak. Trouble from the street, from gangs, from criminality, from drug abuse. And I think it has some correlation, as it actually happens worldwide, that the girls are becoming much more successful in schooling, in education. They seem to be, keeping themselves off, actually, from these kinds of troubles from the street, and thus a very successful way of becoming part of the society. Whereas the boys, this whole issue of masculinity, trying to prove yourself that you're a man, trying to be tough, and maybe not, and also as a result of patriarchal culture, which tends to sort of be in more support of, let's say, boys than girls. So the boys assume that they already have an advantageous position, in the family in particular. Whereas thus, that resulting in a failure, let's say, in terms of educational success as they put themselves in those positions. The second part of the question about class, one thing we have to keep in mind is that, of course, my work is not a sociological work, it's an anthropological work, but there is enough data out there which is all about this level of integration. And there, I will just say one important criterion to keep in mind. It all depends what you're comparing. If you're comparing in time, as you pointed out, compared to, let's say, first generation as opposed to second and third, there's a vast success in socioeconomic integration. In improving education, in improving, participation in labor market. No doubt. Actually, a lot of the businesses are self-owned. If you especially in some similar sense, if you look at the the Hispanic community or the minority community here, you try to find yourself through the ethnic food industry. Then it diversifies and so on, and it's very comparable to what's happening for the second and third generation, let's say German Turks by now. So, whereas if you compare the socioeconomic integration to their peer groups, that is to say, native, majority society, there you see a vast difference, lagging behind. Nearly half, like twice as less educated, nearly, roughly, and twice as less, employed. So, in time, there is great progress, but compared to, will they be able to catch up? So it's all this question of being able to catch up, and that has, I think, to do a lot with various aspects. First of all, generational aspect. Keep in mind that by the 1990s, only by the 1990s, the families believe that they will be there for good. This is very different than, immigrating to U.S. Any immigrant group to the U.S., whenever they come here, they think, I'm here for good. So forget everything about, what you are going to do, what's happening in your country of origin. This was not the case for these labor migrants until the 1990s. So their investments, that's the point, were often in their countries of origin and not always necessarily to the next generation. But that has changed since then, and I think that's also good to keep in mind. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Flip.
Thank you all so much. This has really been splendid. Ahmed, you were talking, listing the various issues of Muslims in Europe. I was making the connection to the United States and thinking how great the above all, the demonization of Islam, which is quite similar. And then, Peter, when you emphasizing the American push to get Europe to see Muslims as security problems, what I wondered was whether there might not be another similarity having to do with who benefits from the demonization of Islam. Now, in the United States, we certainly know that the FBI and other security agencies had a shopping list of things that they wanted before 9/11 and used 9/11 and the fear of Islam as a way to get those enacted into law. Most obviously in the Patriot Act, but in other things as well. And I'm wondering, do you see anything similar having happened in Europe? Did this become an excuse for some elements of the body politic to do what they already wanted to do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think that there was quite as clear of a precursor imperative in Europe on the part of the various security agencies who kind of had in their pocket the list of wants and, oh, now we can go ahead and ask for these and make the case for it. I really think that was driven by incumbent political forces at the time that this issue blew up. And indeed, I think what's happened actually is that the way that European governments approach the whole issue of counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism in Europe had the perverse effect in many cases of driving Muslims into the arms of these movements, because this was the first time in many cases the state had ever thought to really take an interest in Muslims and to put money towards programs focused on Muslims. But instead of addressing the issues that Muslim communities identified as the priorities for their communities, all that money ever addressed was issues related to violent extremism. And this gave space for the politicized and radical groups to say, see, just as we've been telling you all along, the state doesn't care about you. They only care about you insofar as you might or might not blow something up. So there really is no future for you in this country. Your future is with us. In terms of how this is playing in the United States, it has just reached levels of kind of bizarreness and surrealism to me that I'm trying to really get my head around. With the American Muslim community, what's bizarre is that by turning Muslims into a political lightning rod, the Republican Party is potentially missing one of the most important opportunities that it has in terms of building inroads with immigrant and post-immigrant communities in this country. Prior to 9/11, American Muslims tended to vote Republican. Because why? Because it's their natural political home. They are socially conservative and pro-business. Of course they would vote Republican. And so the way that the Republican Party has turned this into, has turned Muslims into a litmus test for loyalty and national security, I think is actually really, damaging an enormous opportunity that party has to broaden its own constituency.
I can just add one thing. There is also electoral reasons, in the sense that being anti-Islam sells. If you look at public opinions across the board in Europe and in the US, Islam, again, the difference is between what do you think about Islam, and it always comes as very negative, anti-progress, anti-women, etc. So there is also this strong component that is there. And to your point, the Muslims, you're absolutely right in the logic, but in the electoral way, Muslims do not count, really. They are less than 2% of the population, so it is more, I would say, profitable to sell anti-Islam than to be pro-Islam, actually.
Right. Any further comments or questions? Yeah. We'll go there for the final question.
Thank you. My name is Dana Hale. I'm an analyst with Delex. Thank you so much for the presentations. I wanted to just ask about something that you mentioned at the end, Ahmet, the challenges that are facing the Islamic community in Europe. I'm more familiar with the Fringe case, but knowing that there's been a huge increase in the number of attacks on mosques and Muslim centers and so on, I'm wondering, just generally for France and Europe, how are the states really looking at those issues and the attacks coming from the right that are obviously all of these different types of attacks on Islamic cemeteries, and are they prosecuting? Because you don't see, or at least I haven't seen much in the press about prosecutions and the state trying to kind of mitigate the extremism and the rise of xenophobic tendencies in Europe. So I just wondered if any of the speakers or all of them would like to comment on that.
Well, you asked, you mentioned my name, but of course on France, we have Jocelyne here. But just wanted to briefly mention, in the Netherlands at least, we have, when, especially after Theo van Gogh's killing, there was this backlash, and at that point, actually tens of arson attacks against mosques and Islamic schools have happened. And at that point, the Dutch Prime Minister Balkenende was very, very supportive. To make a public statement that this is, basically marginalizing the people who are attacking. But in terms of persecution and so on, in the Netherlands, it's very, monitoring such events is very good, and there's a whole center for monitoring xenophobia in Europe. So. Probably one of the best figures actually come from the Netherlands, because they are very good in gathering such data, which is indeed very crucial to gather. But in terms of persecutions and so on, I actually don't know actually much of actually such follow-ups and so on. I guess the biggest example would be Geert Wilders. I mentioned, who's the far right party, who was tried actually. Speaking of which, and he lined up his position as saying, which is, I think, was a common theme here, that he's not against Muslims but against Islam. That in a way, so to speak, got him off the hook of xenophobia. But of course, considering that how Muslims affiliate themselves with Islam itself, you can understand that that's not going to be much of a relief for the Muslim population.
If I can add something on that, there are two different things. What we have witnessed across Europe is an increased tension between some population with Muslim background and the non-Muslim in the area, especially young people. You can see this happening more and more. You have fights. What we have witnessed also in France, and you have lots of desecration of sacred places, but you have also attack on people. In France, for example, there have been a series of attacks of women wearing the hijab by other women, actually. This is we cannot take it anymore. So it's more at this level of interactions between people than there is this political level of anti-Islamic discourse, but you have also sometimes on a daily basis harassment. I would not call this persecution, but there is kind of harassment on a daily basis. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I thought this was an absolutely fascinating and rich session. Ahmed, congratulations on a terrific accomplishment. Thank you, Jocelyne, and Peter, for your contributions. Thank you for joining us, and we're adjourned. A round of applause for Ahmed and colleagues.
Thank you.